All of our content and conversations are available forever on both YouTube and Spotify if you're sadly unable to spend 2 days glued to your screen. But before we even dive into the title conversation, I have a question for all of you. And when it's your turn to answer, I would love for you to introduce yourself as well. And the question is, what's your favorite decade of music? Me, I'm a 90s guy. Give me Third Eye Blind, Ben Folds, and everything else that has the distinctive 90s feel. But how about all of you? What is your favorite decade of music? And who are you? And I guess, Jeremy, because you are to the right of me, you have the honor of going first.
Wow. So I'm Jeremy Storton. I'm the host and owner of the Good Beer Matters podcast. I'm the new guy in the panel, but best decade of music, I've got to say late 70s, early 80s is kind of what I'd go with. A little bit of funk, a little bit of disco, a little bit of the Police. That's kind of what I'd go with.
I can get down with that. Julia, how about you?
Hi, good morning, everyone. I tell my 16-year-old this generation needs to learn from the previous generation's music. And 60s, 70s, you gotta say that's got staying power. Will be evergreen into perpetuity.
Good pick. Michael?
Yeah, hi, I'm Michael Urich. I'm the chief economist at 7 Point Analytic Consulting. I have worked in beer economics for the last 15 or so years, and I really enjoy today's music a lot, but I'd say the music I keep going back to is what I listened to in college. If we're looking for a decade, then 2000 to 2010, I think makes most sense because that's the stuff that I played on Guitar Hero.
Love it. Jeff, how about you?
Yeah, let's go back to college in 2000 to 2010 for me too. Actually, I was out of graduate school by then. Everyone's probably going to go with kind of classic music. I think, the thing that really changed my musical life was when I got into the bebop era of jazz. There was a great jazz station here in Portland, kind of turned me on to a whole new range of music. So I'll throw that out there. I am Jeff Alworth. I write about beer, and I write books and a blog, Beervana blog. I even do some podcasting on the Beervana podcast.
Awesome. Well, thanks for being here. And John, before I give you the opportunity to answer, you're wearing a beautiful Santa Claus hat right now for everyone listening after the fact. And responding with holiday music does not count as a decade of music.
Well, that's unfortunate because, again, I was going with the 1960s. I have to agree with Julia because there's a decade where not only did you have, bands like the Beatles and the Stones, but you also had Sinatra and you had the Rat Pack and you had all of this great of the American songbook and great Broadway being written at the time. It was a really wonderful creative decade. So followed by the 90s for my high school and early college years, along with you as well. I'm John Holl. I write about beer as well. I host some podcasts. I've been doing that for a long time. And I also have really wonderful recommendations for leaf blowers, if anybody is interested.
I appreciate that, John. I appreciate all of you joining us today. Now, for a little bit harder question, I'm going to ask you to think about what's your favorite year of craft beer. And I know it's a lot harder, but I don't think most of you have access to a century of firsthand craft beer experiences. So we have to narrow it down to a tad more than a decade. And you're not a 10,000-year-old wizard like Garrett Oliver. So, John, let's start with you again. To quote your book, Think Beer, Drink Beer, you published it in 2018. In the front cover, you say, right here, right now is the best time in the history of mankind to be a beer drinker. Do you still agree? And is 2021 your favorite year of craft beer?
Yes. So much of it is the experiences in person. It's not just the liquid in the glass, but it's the experiences in person. And 2021 made that difficult to be out in the world. But the few times that I was, because you get to see the passion, you get to see the creativity. If you look at a brewer's tap list, you get to see what really drives them, but what's also driving consumer input as well. And so, I think that there is great beer of great quality being made. There's also innovation that's coming out there. There's also a lot of intimidation, which I'd rather not see. I'd rather see more originality come out of the whole thing. But I think that right now, if you're a beer drinker and you like choice or you like just one particular style, there's endless pints available to you right now. And that wasn't always the case.
So 2021 better than 2018?
Sure. Yeah, I'm curious to hear what everybody else thinks, but I think it's a natural progression, or there's been a steady progression of a lot of fun beers coming out, a lot of technical skill being taught among brewers that is being put into practice, and more brewers that are coming into the game, I think, are thinking about longevity and quality, where that's been a really tough conversation to have with folks for a long time, because it was just, get open and anybody's going to drink what we have. But now with 9,000 breweries, I think consumers are much more discerning, and with the crush of the larger players as well. It's, if you're not bringing your A game, get out of the way.
No, absolutely. Now, everyone else, thoughts on best year in your craft beer experiences?
Oh boy. I'll jump in there. I was gonna say 2012, which was a very exuberant year in craft beer, and it was the year that I first attended the Great American Beer Festival. And one of the things that I think is really special about that time around 2012 is that the craft beer segment had started to really bubble up. I mean, obviously started decades ago, but where it started to get the attention of mainstream beer suppliers, I think, was in the early 2000s, between 2003, 2007. And then about 2012, it had ramped up to a point where it was like, had gotten super mainstream. Many people had either heard of, like beer festivals or attended beer festivals, and it was getting really deep into the mainstream culture. And it was a time before valuations started to fall off, which wasn't actually all that much long after. People are still very, very exuberant, and rightfully so, about the craft beer segment, but the faith that we had in 2012 that it will grow ad infinitum at double-digit rates has since gone away. So that exuberant time, I think, was really special.
Awesome. It's great insight there.
I'll riff on that, and I was trying to remember. I'm a little rusty. I mean, there was 10 years straight of double-digit growth minus 2 years, I believe, and Michael, you might know better, up until 2017. And so that's important. But, from a beer lover perspective, and I did a terrible job of introducing myself. I got a little focused on the best musical decade. So my name is Julia Herz. Opposite of his is how you pronounce it. I'm the former craft beer program director at the Brewers Association, now the executive director of the American Homebrewers Association. And what I want to answer is not 2017. I want to answer the best year is yet to come. And that's not from a ever optimistic, how I roll kind of Julia way. It's because beer is finally getting the cred. It is not, being fought to be poured in the glass as much. We are in glassware, and now it's just, is the glassware clean? We have what John talked about of that innovation, and, if you're not good enough, get out. So that shakeout is starting to happen, where, home brewers that grew up as craft brewers now really realize they have to be, boss at business, not just, the brewing side. So I would say, and the topic of this is what's craft beer in 10 years, let's hope and manifest that in 10 years, it's the best year for craft beer, where you really have had to be on the innovation train, keep that not just science piece, but the art piece in brewing. So the romance continues to have beer eke up and be looked at as wine, except for the stodgy side of wine. The business side has really started to get mature enough to really compete on a level that other manufacturing facilities already have to do.
I like that answer a lot. Jeremy and Jeff, we've got lots of J names today.
Yeah.
I didn't plan this intentionally. It just happened.
Yeah.
Well, I'll jump in there, Jeff, so you can cap it off if you prefer. But for me personally, the year that was very pivotal for me was 2009. I was living in Central Oregon, and didn't really know much or care much about beer at that point, but I was becoming more interested. In 2009, I walked into a bar in Seattle and got Rogue's John Dead Guy. It's now, the iterations are now called Dead and Dead. But John Meyer was their iconic brewer, and John, I forget his last name, was the distiller, and they made this Dead Guy barrel aged whiskey beer that it not only blew my mind, but it opened up my eyes. It was I now suddenly realized that there was just a taint of gray over the world that I didn't notice before. And after sipping that beer, I realized that the world had so much more to offer. And that was the point that I started paying attention, and I started mining my experiences and memories of all the beers going back to my dad drinking Lowenbrau when I was, 7, 8 years old. And it was the beginning moment that has kind of propelled me to what I'm doing today. It was just that awareness of like, wow, there's something more to this thing, and I need to figure out what that is. That for me, that's my personal date. But I would agree with Julia. I think the best is yet to come. I think we'll get into this, but I'm seeing signs that craft beer is now in its middle aged, and it's just really hitting a stride. And I think I see signs that we're on the precipice of kicking into a higher gear and turning this into something even bigger and greater, that the likes of which we haven't seen yet.
I love the optimism on this panel. It's fantastic. And last but not least, Jeff, you're up.
All right, I'll just agree with the group and say I tend to think about beer through a cultural perspective. So just to put a slightly different slant on this, we have never, in the last 180 years or so, we haven't had the kind of excitement about a new beer, style or tradition anywhere in the world that like we've had since American craft beer has come along. If you go anywhere in the world right now, you'll find people excited to start little breweries and make interesting new beer. And what I'm excited about right now, particularly, I think we've seen it most in the last 3 years, and it's going to pick up steam substantially, is that the people who are participating in craft beer in terms of making and drinking it look a lot different than they did 10, 20, 30 years ago. And that's going to be a massive transformation that I'm really looking forward to.
Wow, there's so much we can dive into over the next hour, but let's talk about your years. You all have your favorites, or you kind of tiptoed around the question, but let's look into that crystal ball alongside a mix of data and trends to begin with the futuristic question of where we're going to be in 10 years. And we're about to be in 2022, which is hard enough to fathom. So let's do our best to imagine where our industry will be in 2032. And a lot of you today, when you were talking about your favorite year in craft beer, you were mentioning that experience that took you to the next level. And I have to agree with that philosophy. I think I started homebrewing in 2010, and that really just shot me up in the sky about wanting to educate myself more and learning as much as I could as I dove into books, podcasts, and every craft beer I could possibly try. So what I like to dive into first is education. Education is a fundamental component in our industry, from the conversations between beer nerds about the latest and most obscure beers to the bartender educating that first-time taproom guest on what their brewery stands for. How will education play a role to where we'll be in 10 years?
Who wants to go first?
Well, I'm just waiting for Julia. I'm sure Julia is just like
Yeah.
I'll go first as a beer educator. Thank you for that awkward silence, Andrew.
That was fun. I enjoyed having it.
We're also polite, which is a good thing. So education in 10 years is such a broad way to get at where craft beer will be in 10 years. First of all, I'm going to start on the brewery side as businesses that advertise and market to their audience. And in 10 years, we will even more have shed the shameful advertising of the past, where beer historically from, the large mass producers was promoted to LDA, legal drinking adults that were males, 21 to 34, that basically were a means to get laid. And that was, go in any brewery on a basement and you're going to see a lot of that. You're also going to see some of the romance behind beer, but we're still shedding that. And so in 10 years, I think we will be further along to, and Jeff brought it up, have beer not just be this beverage that's a party beverage, that's a means to, the true buzz to social lubricant, but a sensory beverage itself, and back to beer compared to wine, that is placed more on the pairing table, that you actually have the wine and beverage and hospitality business professionals studying beer as prolifically as they do study wine, and you have the culinary institutions treating beer in as a prolific fashion as they do in the curriculum when they cover wine. And so I think that's a huge one, and I'll leave it at that because I could keep going on and on, but I want to make sure that you each get a chance to tell me where you think beer education will be. And I'll toss the baton, Andrew. I'll go to my partner in crime these days on beer education, Jeremy.
I was going to call him out anyways. Good pick.
Awesome. Thank you. I appreciate it. This is one of the areas that I pay very close attention to. And of course, I've read Julia's book, I've read Jeff's book, I've read John's book, and all this stuff is, all these books that are out there are for the people who, previously are for the people who want to kind of lead this charge. But all of that information, all of that knowledge from Cicerone, BJCP, and all the proliferation of books that are out there, all of that is trickling down to people who are just entering the beer industry, the service industry, and it's we have to remember that we've spent a lot of time in beer. We know beer very well, but there are a lot of people that are just getting started in this, and they don't know what they don't know about beer yet. And so education is going to be and continue to be paramount to this whole thing. But the level and quality of education will become greater and will become more of a standard and not just something that a few people have. I think that's going to be a great democratizing aspect about the beer business moving forward the next 10 years.
And Jeff, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, because the face of the craft beer consumer is definitely going to change over the past decade. I think we're starting to see that. How does education play a role in opening up access and introducing people to craft beer?
All right, you're gonna have to forgive me because it's garbage day here in Portland, and we got a truck rolling by here in a minute. But yeah, I think beer is a little bit different than other beverages in that people don't necessarily think they need a lot of education. I think in the industry, we've gone through a great period with the Cicerone and other projects to educate people who make and sell beer, and that's great. But as a writer, I've been fascinated to see how little people go through formal education. They do their educating in pubs with each other, and here, living in Portland, Oregon, I've seen that the result of that. In that, if you go anywhere where beer is allowed to be sold, it is sold, from like grocery stores where you can buy growlers to gas stations to cinemas, and everybody drinks them, right? And if you just flag somebody in Portland and say, "Tell me about IPA, tell me about stout," they'll have a pretty educated answer. So I think that stuff happens a little bit more osmotically, and the more, again, I don't want to beat this drum too much, but I think the more people who enter the beer industry as consumers and fans, and then the funnel is kind of an inverted funnel. You start as a drinker where there's a lot of people, and then you maybe work at a tap room, and then you start your own brewery, or you write a book or whatever. That process sort of happens organically, and we've seen it over the last 15 or 20 years for sure, and really picking up steam in the last 5 years, and I expect to continue to look like that. So I think this stuff happens in the pubs, and when the people who are in the pubs change, you're going to see that kind of spread out a little bit more, and I'm looking forward to that.
And
I'll just add, they probably are not going to be reading a lot more books based on my my history here.
Michael, Jeff talks a lot about the tap rooms in the space where we're having those conversations, and you look a lot of bigger picture things like at the marketplace. What's the role of education going to have on the marketplace in the next decade?
It's a good and important question. I think that folks have done a pretty good job covering the drinker side of education, but Julia touched also on the supply side of education, and I think it's really, really critical. Over the last 10, 15 plus years, we've seen a lot of people get into the supply side of beer who were enthusiasts, who didn't actually know a ton about how to run a business, people who really, really loved brewing, but maybe didn't have the chops to become a professional brewer. And so I think that learning about the market, learning about the 3-tier system, learning about how the supply chain works from start to finish, all these things are really critical for running a successful beer business. And I really love to see that there are a growing number of educational outlets for the supply side of beer, from the Cicerone program to the brewing and beer industry programs that we're seeing at some universities. I know some of us, myself included, have been involved in the program at the University of Vermont, and I think we're going to see a lot more things like that moving forward.
John, anything you'd like to add on this one?
No, everybody covered it really well. Everything that I was getting ready to say has already been ticked. So it's nice being with like-minded folks.
So what gets you excited about beer in 10 years, John? What changing conditions in the market do you think are going to have the most impact on where we'll be?
See, so the problem, it's not a problem. I guess it's a problem. Being a journalist, though, is not necessarily looking into the future, but dealing with what's happening right now. And it's really nice to be aspirational for a decade from now. But in, this time 2 years ago, none of us were talking about a pandemic that we're living through. So the idea of 10 years from now, strikes me as, fun and crystal ballish and et cetera, et cetera. But the real work to get to 10 years from now needs to be happening today and needs to be happening right now. And I think everything that's happened in beer in the last 2 years that has also been connected to larger societal issues, the work needs to be, it's talked about for a few minutes. So, summer of 2020, after the murder of George Floyd and the rise of the Black is Beautiful beer by Marcus Baskerville et al., the beer conversation centered around diversity and inclusion and social justice in a right way. Last summer, after Brianne Allen asked her question on Instagram, the question became about misogyny and sexual assault and the really terrible sides of the beer industry. And for a few minutes, maybe months or maybe longer, people connected with that in the beer space and said that they were going to try to make meaningful strides towards it. The real work is not in that first week after a post or that first month after a beer hits the market. It's going to be, do people continue to show up and do the work? And so that's the question, I think, is what started right now on those two initiatives, to say nothing of the 100 other initiatives that brewers and consumers in the beer space should be thinking about. What are you doing today that you also did yesterday, and how are you building upon it? And so if we want to get to a better place in 10 years and feel like we're in this sort of utopia of, good feelings and good vibes and quality beer and everything else like that, the work has to be done right now and not just like aspirational and the hope that we get there 10 years from now, because, hope's nice, but it's not hard work.
John, that's an excellent point. It's not about the moment that we're in. It's about making a long-term commitment to creating safer and more welcoming spaces. And I think that's a true thing we need to see in the craft beer industry to see it grow and succeed and mature. So looking at right now and looking at 10 years, what would you like to see brewers and industry professionals do to better make that commitment to creating these safer spaces that can, make these movements from Brianne, from, what Marcus and Black is Beautiful, not just be just a blip in our history, but something that had a long time impact?
Andrew, you bring up the word safe, and I think it's really great we've looked at, I've always said some of the Brewers Association work was basically, saving lives of the safety program, the robust safety program that from the technical side of brewing is really much further along, very, OSHA centric. And there's a lot of good manufacturing practices that are now established and understood by brewers. And if not, the information's there. And adding, for lack of a better way to put it, inclusion and equity to the safety conversation. Hopefully in 10 years, when brewers look at their checklist of like, you want to be a brewery, these are the business things and the benchmarks you have to reach and balancing your financial sheets. You want to be a brewery, this is the brew house hardware that you need at minimum. You want to be a brewery, safety at minimum for your people within the organization is this list. And safety includes that cultural, social aspect of, eliminating bias, having an open workplace where there is the ability to bring true issues to bear in a anonymous light and a safe way. And to me, that all kind of wraps up in the newer thinking of safety since what we've gone through in the last 2 years. And with that, what Jeff said earlier is hopefully in 10 years, we have a much better series of data to look at that shows us that diversity is really present within brewing in a much more prolific way.
No, that's extremely true what you said just now, Julia. Anybody else have anything you'd like to add?
That was lovely.
Yeah.
That was lovely.
We'll just put a bow on that.
Let's switch it up. Michael, you're an economist. You help people understand the marketplace better. In 10 years, are we going to see a continued shift to off-premise?
It's a good question. So I think it would be silly for me to say no, because the shift to off-premise, so a little bit of context. We've seen a big swing towards off-premise throughout the pandemic, and that makes a lot of sense. We had bars and restaurants shut down. Even now, as they've been slowly opening, we've got people kind of reluctant to get out because they are concerned about COVID, people reluctant to get out or maybe not able to get out as much because some people's incomes are depressed. That's going on right now. But for the prior 15 years, we had been already seeing a shift into off-premise. And so, yeah, I think it would be silly for me to say, no, that's not going to continue. I do think that there is probably a limit to it, right? When I first started in beer, it was something like 22 or 23% of the volume was in on-premise. And last I checked, pre-pandemic, it was down to about 17% on-premise. And that includes tap rooms and brew pubs, which have really exploded over the last few years. So I think that will probably continue to narrow. But a few things. One thing that does is it provides opportunities for changes in off-premise, because it's not just that off-premise is getting bigger, it's also becoming more diverse as more small brewers are represented in off-premise. I know really small regional suppliers who have gorgeous canned packaging with high gloss, beautiful stuff on shelves in chain grocery. Okay, folks under 10,000 barrels easily, and I know that's pretty big, but not that long ago, things looked a lot different. If you were under 10,000 barrels 10 years ago, it was real hard to be represented in chain grocery, and now people can do it. In on-premise, just because it's getting smaller doesn't mean there's not loads and loads of opportunity to really wow your guests and to create a really unique experience that people pursue.
That was a lot of great insight there. Anybody else, anything you'd like to add to that one?
I don't remember the question.
We're talking about, will there be a shift to off-premise? Is that going to continue over the next decade?
This one is so hard. If you look historically, this has bounced around a whole lot, and it's bounced around regionally too. So it's one of those. It's a little bit difficult to kind of figure out all the things that contribute to it. So you've got on the one hand, post World War II, post-Prohibition, you had this kind of shift in the market to commodity beer, and so it made it a lot easier for people to buy it in cans. And so you saw the on-premise completely collapse. With craft, people got back into pubs, but now you have the fragmentation of the market. So you don't just have craft beer, you have cocktails, you have seltzer, you have all these other things, and all these different ways to drink in different places to drink them. And the marketing people always talk about occasions, like when do you have drinking occasions? We have more drinking occasions. So when you extrapolate that out 10 years, it was pretty hard to predict.
One thing I want to chime in on there with moving to off-premise, I think for the large part, I don't see a ton of changes if I were to peer into my crystal ball, which I keep right over there. I think distributors have a tried and true playbook, and until something drastically changes with that whole system, that train is just going to keep on rolling down the tracks. One thing I am seeing, however, is smaller boutique, higher end markets are doing things a little bit differently to create an experience. They are trying to cultivate an experience to then turn around and market, and I've seen a few examples of that. I have seen some interesting displays in the off-premise. For example, like this particular brewery has a great plate of nachos, for example, that everyone loves. So now they're going to sell their beer and then put a ingredient list so you can make these nachos at home. So I'm starting to see little snippets that they're trying to take this brewery experience and send that brewery experience home. And this is precedented. We went from years ago, and Jeff was talking about historically, that if you wanted a beer, you had to go down to the brewery or the tap room. And then all of a sudden now, wow, we can take this beer home and drink it when we want it. So I think there's a possibility that we could see some increase in that stuff as well.
And Jeremy, because this is in your wheelhouse as well, here's an education and marketing question for you. How are we positioning these beers in front of people who haven't had them before, if they haven't had that taproom experience?
I think it depends on the beer, because I think anyone on this panel would be delighted for someone to say, here, try this goose. But that's going to be a hard sell at a market next to a plate of corn on the cob. I think there's still going to be education that we talked about earlier is going to have to trickle down to the chain grocery stores, to the boutique markets, to the at some level, these off premises are just serving means to an end. They move widgets from point A to point B, and that's their primary function. But the ones who want to take on this experience will have to educate themselves so that they can properly deliver that experience. And I think people will filter out where you want to go. If John and I were cruising around New Jersey and we're like, hey, I just need to grab a 6-pack of something because we're going to go hang out on the shore, great. Then we'll just go grab something. But if we wanted to go have a cheese and beer pairing at the market so that we can figure out what to buy next week for our holiday party, that's a different thing entirely.
Yeah, we need to come up with the cheese list for that party after this call, by the way.
Email me.
One of the things, though, that sort of is bouncing around in my mind on all of this is, yeah, if you're running into a store to grab a 6-pack of beer or 4-pack or whatever, it's also the price of the beer on the shelves these days. And there are some breweries around this area that are charging $25 for a 4-pack. And if you're a beer fan and a beer nerd and you walk in and you're like, wow, okay, this from Brewery X, this, latest haze bomb with, a really cool label. Yeah, this will look great on Instagram later on. And, hopefully it'll taste good too. And I'll justify that cost of $25. But for, as we're talking about education and we're talking about trying to grow the amount of people that are coming in to the craft beer space, a $25 4-pack is insane to people. And so, and I know there's an economy of scale, and the smaller you are, the harder it's going to be to have competitive pricing. But long term, especially if, the pandemic stays with us for a lot longer, a lot of people are going to start looking at their wallets again. They're going to start looking at what is the best value for what I'm going to get. And in some cases, it's not necessarily even going to be taste or cool label. It's going to be, I got $15 in my pocket and I can get this 15-pack of, a larger company's IPA, and that's going to go a lot farther than a $25 4-pack. And so, for the people who are running in down the shore over the summer, that plays huge into it, of, what they're grabbing at that time versus, as Jeff was saying, the occasions as well. But if the occasion is a random Tuesday, brewers, I think, need to sort of be thinking about, well, what's the long play here? And I don't have the answer. Maybe Michael does, but I don't have
Michael,
the answer.
I'd love to hear your insight on this.
Yeah, well, so I'm thinking here about probably Maserati's never going to be a mainstream brand. That's a good point, but that doesn't that's not really speaking to their business model. I think folks selling a $25 4-pack, I well, I really hope they don't have aspirations of taking a $25 4-pack to the point it's like as big as a Miller Lite, right? So like there's a niche consumer out there who's got money to spend and wants a $25 4-pack. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think it's really important to caution that not every brewer can do that or should, right? Because that's always going to be a small market. And just like Maserati is always going to be a really, really small part of the car market. But like, yeah, we need to know that, have that realistic view that, you know, not every brewery is going to be able to do that. Most of the off-premise volume is going to continue to be in, you know, 6-packs that cost, oh goodness, I hope that 6-packs stay under $20 for the next 10 years. You know, 12-packs, like I'll tell you this, I personally, right here, it's 2021, I'm very reluctant to spend more than $20 for a 12-pack of beer. It happens occasionally, but you know, that's where most of the volume, I think, in the large areas of like where people are doing volume, it's going to be, you know, 6 and 12 packs, maybe 15, 18 packs, maybe 24 packs. But if you get into a 24 pack of craft beer, even today, you're looking, you know, well over $30, and folks can't really do it. And yeah, no, not a lot of folks are going to be doing $25 4-packs. And to go back to something that we mentioned a little bit earlier, on the diversity and inclusion side, we were talking about it mostly on like the employment side, stuff like that. But Julia mentioned also, you know, making sure that our labels aren't turning people off. We need to make sure that our price points aren't turning people off. John makes a really good point. If people see if people thought that looking into the car market and they thought like, oh, geez, every car on the block is a Maserati and I can't afford a car. Like, that's not actually true, but maybe that's the way it might appear, is if craft is doing Instagram and everything else as if everybody should be drinking $25 4-packs, then that's a mistake. So I think that we do need to make sure that the side of beer that we present is approachable.
No,
I'd love to take the excuse me, the contrarian view, Michael, with all due respect.
Not at all. Go ahead.
It's not all about volume. Look what wine has done, and look what wine charges. You have to, in 10 years, kind of bring us back to the question, where is beer going to be? And then you all started talking price point, and it's also, what is beer, right? What is beer flavored beer in 10 years? And the entire, not only has craft gotten watered down and usurped, the concept of what is craft, but also now the concept of the beverage itself is going to get watered down. And I'm here to say, especially, let's look at direct to consumer sales and the prices that people are willing to pay for shipping, right? It's not just what they're putting in their online basket or app that they're putting in for the cost of the beverage, but they're willing to pay for it to ship it to them. So I totally think it's just perception. And if you are a company that can give people value in the brand and product that you produce, then you have every right and should be rewarded for the price that you have to charge. And, you know, it's a dangerous topic to kind of, I think, predict what people will and won't pay when there's just, it's not one answer to the beverage of beer. And I really, really want to, counsel that breweries should be bullish on what they can charge. And they're all going to have to, I'm seeing from the trades and talking to brewers, pricing, especially with next year and supply chain and accessibility to cans and all of the stuff in the space right now, pricing's going to go up. And so when it goes up, if the entire category, back to education, can educate those on the front lines, right? The grocery store clerk, the beer buyer at the local on-premise, bistro. Everyone, if they believe in beer and believe in the value and believe in the cost it takes to get that into the actual can, bottle, or keg, then I think we could do a better concerted effort over time to get the pricing mantra to be away from that $5 6-pack that the biz let itself get into in the 90s, and get back to what's real about beer, which is paying for value.
And I believe many of you already mentioned, the occasion you're drinking for, whether you're just going to the beach to drink some cream ale, you're doing that cheese pairing with Jeremy and John, you're going to have something special for each occasion. But what I want to talk about now is something you alluded to, Julia, is, what will beer be in 10 years? And Jeff, we're going to start with you on this one. You just put out the beer Bible, and I got to begin with the S word I hate to say sometimes. Is seltzer beer, and is it in your beer Bible?
No, it's not in my beer Bible, and it's not beer. You can make seltzer out of sugar water. Beer is, I have a fairly liberal definition of beer, which is any fermented malt beverage. So we're talking sake, we're talking chicha, we're talking traditional African beers. These are all, of course, classic beers that have been made for centuries and in many cases millennia. But seltzer is not that. Seltzer is an industrial product that is not really, much to do with the craft of making beer. And Julia and I may actually have some disputes about the line between craft and not craft. But I will defend people who have spent their life trying to learn how to make what is a very complex product out of process and ingredient that goes back to, roots in the soil all the way to packaging and beer that goes out to the world. So much difficulty in producing quality product out of all those levers and all those steps. So. No, I think we do need to, as people who care about this beverage and everything to do with it, we need to be a little bit like, I'm not into shaming anybody who likes seltzer or any beverage. Drink what you like, right? But there's a reason why people who make beer, whether it's in a small house brewery in Franconia or down the street from you in your hometown, deserve to be respected for what they do. It's not an easy thing, especially if they're making good beer. So I'll get off my soapbox now and say, what will beer look like in 10 years? It's impossible to say, but if you look at the craft beer era in the last 40 years that it's been around, if you look at craft, what was craft beer in 1980? What was it in 1990? What was it in 2000? 2010 and 2020, each one of those moments, you look at craft beer, it's radically different, right? It goes through pretty substantial transformations. So I think it would be crazy to say we've hit a point of equilibrium and things aren't going to change. They'll just kind of, the trends will just sort of stabilize and maybe attenuate a little bit. I certainly wouldn't go there. People who read me know that I'm spectacularly bad at predicting the future, so I try to avoid it at all costs. But if we look at early trends, I think here in Oregon we tend to be kind of ahead of the movement nationally, and lagers have really taken purchase. Most breweries are required to have a lager in the regular lineup because there's so many people who like them. This is an area nationally which could grow quite a bit. So I would expect to see something on that front. The ingredient side is super fascinating to me. We've seen a lot of it development in terms of hop breeding and what's going on in Yakima, but mostly that's been on the proprietary side. Now we're seeing many more hops being released from the USDA side, so those will be help keep prices down. And then the thing that I'm really excited about in terms of it's less to do with style, but I think it will really inflect craft hugely over the next decade, is craft malt, which is made in such small volumes now that it's quite expensive. But that will come down as those volumes increase, and they begin. If craft maltsters can begin to offer a price point that's competitive with Weyermann, for example, imported malt, that will change things pretty radically, and it will help. I think support those styles like lagers or saisons or old English styles that we've kind of forgotten about that depend on characterful base malts. Those could become more interesting to people when they actually discover that malt has flavor and it's fun. So now that definitely won't happen because I predicted it. Well,
Jeff, you give us so many things to dive into. I got a follow-up for you though. With malt and barley prices going up quite a bit right now for especially some of the larger companies, some of the craft maltsters are able to compete a little better right now. Do you feel this is their end to get recognized, to get their foot in the door with a lot more brewers to, make the impact you think they will over the next decade?
Yeah, I do. And I mean, I don't think it's going to happen in the next year or two. You've alluded to this barley crisis that we have here. But if we blow that out a bit and look at the way we produce barley in the United States, it's very environment sensitive because of where we grow it. So craft maltsters are now working with universities to grow barley varieties that are suited for where they're growing them. And so they're going to have better yield, they're going to have better quality, and that will actually make it easier for them to compete on price because they're going to, they're growing it in this way that will ultimately, once they get their volumes up a little bit, make them competitive with this industrial barley production, which is happening in places that are pretty susceptible to what we just saw in the past year, which is going to drive barley prices up, right? So those barley prices are going to go through the roof this next year or two. So yeah, I think so, and I think for on both sides, because I think industrial barley will go up, and I hope that we'll see smaller barley producers kind of pulling the way forward as the climate changes.
Now let's go back to the conversation on flavors and styles. Over the past decade, we've seen the rise of new styles, and IPA has evolved into a wide variety of, let's just call them unique sub-styles. Will we get even more hyper-focused on certain things, or as Jeff alluded to, will we see the rise of more craft lagers?
I think so. I think if I can pull a page from John's book, he said that we can't, as writers, as media, we can't just make stuff up. I mean, if we could, then the 3 billionaire space cowboys are going to set up a space station to brew beer, and then Amazon's going to ship it to us for $28 a 4-pack, but that's not based in reality. What is based in reality, like Jeff just mentioned, is we have a lot more craft maltsters that are giving us a sense of a regional taste. Maybe I'll even use the T word, terroir. Coleman Farms in OSU is studying hop terroir. I think the signs are there that we have the ability to move back to, especially within the craft beer industry, to move back to a sense of place within the flavor profiles. And then getting into the styles, you mentioned IPA. I mean, I've talked to people in Mexico City and Lyon, France, where they're making their own IPAs using their own ingredients. And so these styles are going to continue to pan out and then give us a sense of, hey, I love IPA, but have you ever tried a French IPA, a Southern French IPA, or a Mexican IPA? It's great with tacos. We're going to have, I think, a lot of these different styles, lagers as well. We're going to go away from the international lager and move to this regional. We're hopefully we'll finally have a definition for a good tropical lager and stuff like that. Like we have a tropical stout. I think we have the potential to move toward that more specificity when it comes to flavors and styles.
The thing is, though, we really need brewers and consumers to give some of these new styles that emerge a chance to shake out and a chance to sort of establish what the parameters are, because there's a lot of brewers that really love to color outside the lines, and that's really great. And then you have a lot of brewers that want to be technically perfect and live up to historical styles. But as new things emerge, and I've been talking a lot about Brut IPA just because we were all able to see the birth, the brief life, and then the spectacular death of a style in about 8 months. And I think a lot of that had to do with it came out, it got some press, it had a lot of interest around it, and all brewers from around the country were like, okay, well, I have sort of a vague idea of what this is, and they started messing around with it. And if you were a beer consumer going from one to another to another to another brewery and trying their version of a brewed IPA, you were getting 8 different things, and there's such confusion that by the time the rest of the world would have been ready to be paying attention to it, the brewers had given up on it because they didn't know what it was, and it wasn't connecting with people fast enough, and they were already on to glitter beer or the next shiny thing, like whatever that is. So as these new sub-styles emerge, I would love over the next decade for the creating brewers to, one, think about, okay, what do we hope that this is, and here are some, rough guidelines that other people should try, and then color outside of the lines, but at least like, this is what we've learned that works, and here's why. And Kim Sturtevant was doing that with Brewed IPA, but it just sort of got away, from him very, very fast. So long term, as new styles come out, give them a chance to grow, but give them some parameters, to grow into. Think of it as like a seedling, right? You're not just going to take a seed, toss it in your backyard, and hope to get tomatoes. You're going to cultivate it, and let it grow from there. And I'm not really a gardener, so I don't know how to continue on with that analogy, but that's my general thought.
No, that's great insight. Now, Jeff, I believe you're the one who wrote this, and correct me if I'm wrong. You said we'd sell a lot more Saison if they were called farmhouse IPAs. Was that you?
Yeah, I didn't even say farmhouse. I just said call them IPAs.
So, how does the marketing and branding behind these beers, influence the growth of, certain styles or more sub styles or more, even new styles?
Well, I just went on a long jag here, so maybe I'll let someone else answer that, and leave aside the question of whether you should call a Saison an IPA.
Yeah, let's keep calling them Saisons, please.
Yeah, I like calling them Saisons too. I think that when we had the debate about black IPA and what to call it, I was on the side of don't be too slavish to what terms have meant in the past. Make it easy, make it accessible, right? And why I liked calling it black IPA was that tells people what it's going to taste like and what the experience is going to be like. It's going to be bitter and aromatically hoppy, and it's going to have some dark roast malt character. I think that makes a lot of sense. And if people don't know the word Saison and don't know what to expect, if they see that on a label, there's two ways to go with that. There's education. You can say, hey, here's what Saison means, and that's a perfectly viable way to go. But if a brewer wants to take the maybe easier way and say this is some variation of IPA, and as long as the experience that the drinker has resonates with that name, I actually think that it's totally fine. And as an economist, I'm not going to take a position as to which way is better or good, but I'd say the one that works in the marketplace is the one that's good.
But here's the interesting thing about black IPA or Cascadian Dark or whatever. When that style really began to emerge, and again, it was sort of one of these New England style things that got out there, and then the Pacific Northwest got a hold of it and did some really cool stuff with it. And out here on the East Coast, it became really hard for people to figure out what it was, because you weren't just, Michael, your description of what that beer should be is really wonderful, but there's people who are like, well, I'm just taking a stout and I'm adding a ton of hops to it. It's like, well, no, that's not what we're doing here. I mean, then there's also, American style stouts that already are aggressively hopped. So being able to accurately tell folks what a style is remains really hard. And, again, I think having some at least some rough guidelines, because once you have one of these that's well made, yeah, you want to drink the beer all the time. But if it's a black IPA and somebody goes light on the hops or too heavy on the roast or something like that, it's going to turn off a drinker. And, especially if they don't know what that is going into it, and then they're not going to come back to it. And then we're all the much sadder for it.
John, go ahead, Jeremy.
Well, I just want to add one little thing. I agree with that, because I think we need to give it a little bit of space to breathe and have a chance to live again, much like Gosa, for example, because I think a few of us remember once upon a time we all wore bell bottoms. Then they went out of style. When they came back around, they were called bootcut jeans. And so it's kind of one of those things where you have to give it some space to live again, and maybe a future generation will appreciate it.
All right, we're going to have to talk about the dress code for this cheese party, by the way.
A great step in the right direction. And then, Andrew, you should bring us home. Let's get away from acronyms for the major beer styles sold. If you want to attract newbies into the mix, not just people that do know about beer, but then don't know about a new style, spell out the actual style. That's a good start.
And I have a follow up to that, because, Jeremy, you mentioned how many sub styles and unique terroir related styles there could be over the coming years. But John, what you've alluded to is there could be almost too many styles. Are we overloading the consumer with choices right now?
Can I jump in here on this one? I was about to say that I think if you look historically and regionally, once you have mature beer culture, you always have a winnowing of styles, right? You don't. If you go to Munich, you don't find Belgian triple. You don't find British cask ale. If you go to London, you don't find a lot of Hellas's, although you're finding more now. But that may be a bad example. The thing is, people don't have the bandwidth for 100 styles, and they begin to have preferences. And right now in the United States, the preference is towards hoppy ales. So I think if you look 10 years in the future, are we going to have more or fewer styles, more or less variety? I think it's almost. It would be inconceivable, it would be unprecedented for us to continue to have more and more styles. I think you're going to see that winnowing, and so things like Saison, which just don't have the popularity, are probably going to fall away. So I hate to break that news, but that's what I watched happen everywhere else throughout time.
Well, I've got one final question to wind us down. It's probably the most loaded question I could throw at you with just a couple minutes to go. But looking at 2031, 2032, and we could dive into a lot more conversation on where the taproom model will be, where people will be drinking off premise, where they'll be buying. But how many breweries will there be in 10 years? Like I said, loaded question, but the whole purpose of this conversation is slightly futuristic.
I'll jump in, and I think I brought this up in our prep, that we reached a level of breweries of 4,000 plus. I'm a little rusty on the actual number of hundreds, but 4,000 plus in the late 1800s in the United States. Based on the population, that was a lot less in the United States then. If you translated that to whenever we did the math for this, call it 2016, something like that, it showed that the U.S. could support 30,000 plus breweries. Right? A brewery is the big mass produced, it's a globally, owned conglomerate brand, or the local nano brewery down the street. And just like every restaurant, can open up as long as they deliver a good experience and, are good at business, they can survive. So I think we could have tens of thousands of breweries in the United States. They're not going to be mass producing. And that will, come to be true or not in 10 years. But the number of breweries is going to continue to grow as the number of breweries that don't get it will continue to see a shakeout.
I agree with you, Julia. I think that Cheers taproom model is something that can work.
Yeah. The number of breweries in the country, I have to say, I do not care about at all, as long as during the next 10 years, I get a brewery in the town where I live.
I like it.
The rest of the country can have. I want a brewery that does really good lagers and some really crystal clear West Coast IPAs, and that is within walking distance of my house. That's all I want for Christmas this year and every year. So 10,000 is really nice, as long as one of those is. 30,000 is really nice, as long as one of those is where I live.
Fantastic answer.
We've got
three more of you who haven't answered this question. I'm curious.
My simple answer. Sorry, Andrew. My simple answer is this. I'll let Michael do the counting. My simple answer to how many breweries will we have in 10 years from now is yes. Just one yes.
Yes. I like it. As long as they have a unique experience, right, Jeremy?
What? Say that again.
As long as they have a unique experience to offer.
Well, they will filter out the clientele, and so the dust will settle eventually. So, yeah, I agree.
I think we're moving more towards a restaurant model for breweries where they come and go a little bit more often. And the old family-owned breweries that have been around forever are probably going to be way more diminished over time. So, the recent news about Bell's is a good example. So, yeah, maybe 20,000, but old stalwarts, fewer and fewer.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think that the rapid growth in the sheer number of breweries that we've seen was transition from one equilibrium point to a new equilibrium point. And I think that if we extrapolated that line and said, hey, that's just going to keep on growing, I think that would demonstrate a lack of understanding of how transition among equilibria happens. So yes, restaurant model, yes, tiny breweries will continue to proliferate. And I think that we do move to a place where about as many come as go in a given year. But in terms of the sustainable number of pretty big brewers who are in distribution, that are household names, that are, in several states. I think that we are probably not looking to gain a ton more of those in the next 10 years in terms of number. The players that are in that set might shift a little bit.
Yes, I agree with everyone here. There is no answer. 2 years ago, we didn't know a worldwide pandemic was about to hit us. And, 10 years from now is impossible to predict. But the fun of this was, the five of you have such great careers and histories and insight in our industry. It was just fascinating to listen to. So I appreciate all of you being here today. Jeremy, Julia, Michael, Jeff, and John. This is a fun conversation. And John, you're the most festive of us all today, despite not wearing the bow tie. I hope you all have a great holiday season. I'm looking forward to seeing you all, in 2022. And this was just a fun, insightful conversation. So thank you all for being here again, and enjoy the rest of Panel Fest. See
Thanks,
you later,
Andrew.
everybody.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Andrew.
Take care, everyone.
Great work. Bye, everybody.